The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
And hello and welcome. My name's Charles Christian, and you're listening to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show on podcast and on internet radio. And once again, thank you very much for listening in. We've got our usual eclectic mix of stories, and we also have the second and concluding part of our interview with Greg Bufithis about the impact of the moon on literature and culture and mankind. This is following on from the fact that this year saw the 50th anniversary of the first landing on the moon. Now, on with the show. And here's Janie, and she's got some bad news for all fans of Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster.
Yes, this is news fresh in from Reuters. Must be true. Scotland's Loch Ness Monster, which I'm sure probably many people in the world have heard about. It's not just a Scottish tale.
It's probably the most famous cryptozoological phenomenon.
Yeah,
ever.
I was thinking that. So yeah, we don't need to describe that. You know, it's kind of thing. Loch Ness is a massive body of water, and it's long been held that there must be a monster in there because there was some photographic evidence at one point. More on that later. But anyway, there had been some positing of could it be a giant eel? I think yes. Because you tend to see the loops in so that humps, loops, anyway, breaking the water.
Yes.
And anyway, scientists said that after an intensive analysis of traces of DNA in the loch's icy waters, it could be, as I say, a giant eel. So backing up some of the early reports. Now, the other thing with this, I suppose, slightly bad news, is that the results did rule out the presence of large animals, such as dinosaurs, which is a bit of a shame. But there was a lot of eel DNA in the loch. And a geneticist from New Zealand's University of Otago, by the name of Professor Neil Gemmell, had a little press conference and told people. So it's hit the news. And anyway, apparently he said, this was quoting him, eels, not heels. Eels are very plentiful in the loch system. And they sampled lots of different sites, and every single one of them had obvious large amounts of eels by the amount of DNA. But the sheer volume of it apparently was a bit of a surprise. So they feel, or Gemmell, our geneticist, feels that they can't exclude the possibility that there's a giant eel in Loch Ness. But we don't know whether these samples we've collected are from a giant beast or just an ordinary one. Or rather, perhaps just a rather lot of an ordinary one. And so there's still this element of we just don't know. So anyway, he went on to note that despite the idea of a giant eel having been around for decades, nobody had ever caught a giant one in the loch. But apparently it's very, very deep, isn't it? It's incredibly deep. I don't know. 100 miles deep?
No.
No.
It is, I think, the UK's deepest water.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, the international team of scientists who took their samples of so-called environmental DNA in June last year, said it is a valid way and well-established way to find out to monitor marine life, like whales and sharks. So it's a well-tried system.
Yeah.
Because whenever a creature moves through its environment, it leaves behind tiny fragments of DNA from its skin, scales, feathers, fur, whatever, and of course, poo and pee.
Yes.
And this DNA, or in those materials, it can be captured and then sequenced, and they can very precisely identify that creature by comparing the sequence to huge databases of known genetic sequences from hundreds of thousands of different organisms.
Yes.
So the science is there. So the background is that the first written record of a monster relates to the Irish monk St. Columba, who is said to have banished a water beast to the depths of the River Ness in the 6th century. So there we have perhaps the first mention of a possible monster.
Yep.
The most famous picture of Nessie is actually known as the surgeon's photo, and it was taken in 1934. I don't know whether that's because he was
a surgeon.
He was a surgeon. One does tend to think that might be the case.
That's why everybody thought it must be true, because they
yes,
didn't think,
yeah, absolutely.
A surgeon wouldn't pull a joke.
Yeah. He's a bit of a clever cove. Yes, because and the picture showed, as I was alluding to, a head on a very long neck emerging out the water. Which
like
I suppose
most people's idea of a plesiosaur.
Yes, I was going to
dinosaur.
say, yeah,
Yes,
that's
yes.
how it perhaps became thought, which would be very exciting if it was, but of course. However, it was revealed 60 years later to have been a hoax, and that was used. It was a sea monster model attached to a toy submarine. Apparently, there have been many unsuccessful attempts to track down the monster, notably in 2003, when the BBC, our erstwhile BBC, funded an extensive scientific search that used 600 sonar beams and satellite tracking to sweep the whole length of the loch. And even just 3 years ago, when a high-tech marine drone found a monster, we all got quite excited, but it was not the one it was looking for, obviously, because the discovery turned out to be a replica used in the 1970 film The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. And the replica sank about 50 years ago. And that was that. That's what they found.
Yes.
So there you are. Sorry if that's deflated your little delusion about monsters.
The most famous lake monster in the world is probably an eel.
Yeah. About 2 foot long, I think they go to.
They do go a bit longer.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you very much. And now time for the second and concluding part of our interview with Greg Bufithis on the impact of the moon on literature and culture down the centuries. And I should have mentioned this before, but you can find out more about Gregory Bufithis on his website. That's Gregory, Gregory, Bufithis, it's a Greek name, Bufithis, all one word, no breaks, .com. GregoryBufithis.com. On with the interview.
There's certain things in nature, there's certain topography, and it very much, I mean, you can, even in Greece, you can see the moon in different skies, different coloring. We tend to always see, at least in the area where I am in Greece, this bright white moon. But there are other places in Greece where, we've all seen it before. It has an orange tint.
Yes, yeah.
Or a red tint. And there's an area just outside of Athens called Sunion, which has probably one of the last almost completely standing temples in that I think almost all the columns are there. And whenever there's a blood moon, when you have that famous large moon, so what they call supermoon in a couple of years, every photographer in the area runs there because you can juxtapose this moon over this temple.
Yes, I've seen
and
the
I have several
picture, yes.
Greek photographers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can see, you start floating those photographs around, and I have one, a fabulous photo of it taken some years ago back at my other home in Brussels. And, it literally, you cannot look at that picture and not think about feeling, I got to write about this. I got to think something about this. It's that kind of a thing to me. And I think that when you go through and spend some time with it, we had talked about this before. I'm going to publish on my blog a list of what I think of the 2025 major pieces about the moon, most of them science fiction. To give people an idea of, how people got inspired and why, and how, honestly, even, political issues arose. To give you an example, there was a piece that was written by Robert Helion in, I think it was the late 40s, which is basically Escape to the Moon. Why? Because the U.S. ended the war with two bombs, two atomic bombs. And the thing was, hey, boys and girls, I'm getting the hell out of here. Where am I going? I'm going to escape to the moon. And, there's lots of, inspirational things. Even Arthur Clarke there's a short story by Arthur Clarke, and that he wrote in 1955. And when he wrote it, he said it was completely inspired by what I saw as what I thought was going to be horrendous Cold War tensions. And he said, and it was one of the first books, I think, that talked about the moon having planetary settlements, still controlled by the Earth, et cetera, et cetera. But, again, inspired by politics. So, and we've talked about this before. Until you put the timeline, until you draw the timeline, and I had basically fallen into it again, as I said, by a suggestion from David Seed. But when I started getting into it and I started drawing the timelines and I started looking at, okay, so he wrote about this, so he must have been inspired by that. It makes a fascinating history. And, our time on this earth and our time during the day is so limited that you can only focus on certain things. And I'm sure there are other areas of both science and literature that we can say have the same kind of inspiration, and that if one drew a timeline, one could make a connection to something that happened in science, something that happened in politics, something that's happened in culture during that time period. But for me, it's easy because I was already into it. I was already there. So it just made a natural progression that I should now look at a more, in a deeper way, to look at the moon from the standpoint of that romantic globe I see every night, and to figure out, okay, what have other people written about? What have other people been inspired by? And I think that when you look at, some of the works, obviously, we could probably critique as being poor literature. Some stuff just stands out. But the point is that when you look at it, for me anyway, I'll avoid the grammatical mistakes. I'll probably avoid a lot of the, redundant sentences. I'll probably avoid and ignore a lot of things and just look for the spirit, the concept, what was the feeling? And which I do now, even with current science fiction. I tend to be, in general, a cynic, as you well know, and I tend to be a bit of a pessimist as far as where I think all this technology is going. So I'm, I look at these inspirational pieces of literature about the moon as taking me in a more sunny place. At least that's what my wife thinks. So I'm more, and I'm more attuned to how one can think about and write about something in a more happy mood, and that's good too. And it gets me away from this day-to-day bashing of disinformation wars we're going through, and gets me into something more fun. And yes, it's an escape. But it's something that you certainly demonstrate every day your passion for literature, your passion for sci-fi. And I have, made the Apollo missions, as it were, mine. And I, have seen every movie or try to see every movie. They're in this, for lack of a better phrase, I guess, this bibliography that I'm going to put together on my blog. I'm going to list all the great movies that are out there. And they're one of my favorites. And why someone did not do this earlier, I have no idea. There was a movie that was produced by CNN documentaries, and it was produced in 2018. And they had said, hey, NASA, we're doing some research in preparation for the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. Can we run around your archives? And NASA said, yeah, sure. You're CNN, why not? And the producers and the technical guys find, for the first time, something like, I've lost the actual number, but this is approximate.
Yeah.
Find 18,000 hours of video and audio, most of which has never been seen or shown. And it was shot with super sophisticated 65 millimeter cameras, which I didn't even realize existed then. And they went through this. It took them about a year because they were just focusing on the Apollo 11. And they produced a movie called Apollo 11, which came out last year, but it really hit the mainstream earlier this year. And if you watch it, you would swear this was filmed yesterday. And what they did was they brought in no experts. It's the original audio track and the original video footage of the Apollo 11 team training, talking to themselves, talking to the NASA people, going from liftoff to coming back to Earth. It's just their chatter. And some of the scenes you've seen, but I guarantee you most you haven't. And what was fascinating was it wasn't so much the tech talk. It was, and I mentioned this in a blog post, you don't realize, I had not believed the number until I had done a lot of research. But if you add up all the people at NASA, plus the 172 companies that, designed both the rockets and the software, you come up with 400,000 people. 400,000 people were involved in that. And there's a clip, which I'd never seen before, of Neil Armstrong from space. They're heading back, thanking all those people, basically, and saying, we're nothing. We're just the front guys. You think we're brave. You think we're this. Nah. We're here because of the 400,000 of you.
Yes.
And it's one movie that I think the way it was done captures the whole spirit of it without having somebody come in and explain it to you.
Yeah.
You don't need it.
Yeah.
You're going to get lost in the technology and you're going to get lost in the atoms, but the point is you don't really get lost for that long time. You get the feel of these guys biting nails when they first have to eject themselves from the Earth's orbit and shoot themselves toward the moon. And they use and they integrate into it all of the actual models, sketches, and diagrams that they actually use to plan the mission. So, why someone hadn't done that before, I have no idea. But that's an example of somebody doing a deep dive, going into the literature, but then letting the literature speak for itself.
Yeah.
I droned down there for a bit. I'm sorry. I get very passionate about this area. So
that piece you mentioned about the 400,000 people, there's a bit of a internet meme going around at the moment saying what's amazing about all the conspiracy theories and fake news that the moon landings were faked is that 400,000 people have been in on the conspiracy and kept quiet for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Which sort of sets it into context,
Yeah. I mean, you must have seen the scene. It was, I don't know how many years ago it was filmed, but Buzz Aldrin was giving a talk. And based on he's 82, 83 now.
Mm-hmm.
So this might have been when he was 60s. And he was being accosted by this video team, which were at the time, I guess, one of the big groups that said it was a fraud.
Yeah.
And they kept shoving a microphone into his face saying, "Will you please admit, sir, that this was fake, that the moon landing was fake?" And he just turns around and clocks the guy. I mean, he just, decks the guy. And I was hysterical. I was like, yes, go for it. I mean, it was like, people were saying, what was the movie Capricorn 1? How they would fake a moon landing. And I remember a friend of mine who had seen the movie, and we were talking about it recently, obviously in the lead up to the 50th anniversary. And he said, it's movies like that that just really screw it up. Because, he said, there's some guy sitting out in Iowa. Yep, I always thought that,
Yep.
It's just, and the worst thing about it now is, these conspiracy theories have been out there for years. But the problem is that the way social media is structured, they're getting bigger voices. And,
yes.
In a world where everything is false and everything is a conspiracy, you expect it and you cringe because here is something, and we can go, back and forth on the socio-political aspects of this. I mean, you had read my post from last week when I did my dedication to it. There's a lot to be said by the civil rights movement, money that could have been spent on improving this or improving that, et cetera. And the reality is, what did the space, from people on the ground, for us on Earth, what did it give to us? Well, it actually ended up giving us a lot of stuff. I mean, it perfected insulation, it gave us tang, it perfected coffee, it perfected the most biggest thing in my world and our world is and remember, it was only 8 years from the time John Kennedy said they were going to do it to the time they did it. Mm-hmm. NASA learned, and when you look at these computers, I mean, how dated they were. NASA had figured out how to manage complex systems and how to integrate them And the reason I bring that up is last 2 days, literally 2 days after the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, Chris Kraft died. Mm-hmm. Now, Chris Kraft was mission director. He was basically the voice and face of NASA for God knows how many years. He was the voice we all heard when Walter Cronkite was telling us about this or that and the other thing. But people, unless you know a lot about the space industry, people just basically said, okay, so he's the guy that talks to the astronauts and he makes the announcements. He's the PR guy. No, this guy was an aeronautical engineer. He designed a lot of the software. He was the guy they brought in when the Apollo 1, when the 3 astronauts died on the launch pad.
Yeah.
The fire.
Yeah.
They brought him in because at that time he had moved into a different position and he was more managerial. They brought him immediately, and he began saying, "Look, here's all the things you did wrong." And he's the guy. He was the first guy, and people, basically crucified him for this. And then eventually they realized, okay, in context, he was right. He basically said, those 3 guys, their death saved the space, saved Apollo. Why? Because, and you need to do a lot of reading on this, but basically Apollo reached a point where it was getting a little expensive. Contractors were taking shortcuts. The wiring for that particular capsule was horrendous because the wires were clearly not first rate. They were bundled in a way that would easily accelerate a fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened was he took over, he took charge, and everyone said, no one wanted to mess with him. And he basically said, all right, we're going to do this, and they did. And they went back to the way they had done it. They had lost, for a moment there, they had lost the mastery of complex systems. And many of us listening to this know that, we see it in house construction, we see it in apartment construction when the wrong cement is used or the wrong floorboarding is used, etc. When you're sending a guy up when you're sending a guy on a 285,000 mile trip, you better have it right. Yeah. And he restored the confidence, forced them to add. I think they added something like 20 to 25 safety checks to the process. And the reason I bring that up is when you watch this movie Apollo 11, I mentioned a little while ago, they actually run through the entire checking sequence. They basically go through, ISO check, medical check, and they even they added in all kinds of medical sensors that were attached to the astronauts, so that they not only had telemetry readings for the spacecraft, they had telemetry readings for the astronauts. And it was the first time, I believe, I'm almost positive, it was the first time on Apollo 11 that the public was able to watch it and find out that Neil Armstrong's heart rate went from 80 to 135. Why? Because when the lunar module disengaged from the command ship, the Columbia, the computers had said, you're going to land at XYZ. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin saw that XYZ was a crater, that the computer had obviously made a mistake, he basically took over manual control of it. He had maybe 15 seconds worth of fuel, which Buzz Aldrin didn't tell him because he didn't want to give him even more pressure. Yeah. And Armstrong's heart rate went from 80 to 100, and I think 130, 135, some huge number. But it was because way back, Chris Kraft had said, we need to be monitoring these guys as well as we're monitoring the spacecraft. And, those kinds of things can only be done by people in the know.
Yeah.
And, Chris Kraft literally breathed and died that business. And getting back to this other point, our main point, which is the literature, there is, when the astronauts go around the dark side of the moon, there is literally, I think, 22 seconds when they have absolutely no communication with the Earth. When they come back into reentry and they hit the atmosphere, I think it's closer to a minute and something. And when you watch the Apollo 11 movie, you see these guys, literally biting their fingernails when they go around the dark side of the moon because they're not in contact with them. And, it's like Apollo 11 check, Apollo 11 check. And then when they're coming back into Earth, again, to show you the human element, the most fascinating thing was, so Apollo 11, they come back into the Earth's atmosphere. It's not detected yet by the guys back in Houston. But one of the guys on the helicopter goes, "Hey, I see him." That's where I'm at on all this stuff. I mean, the human element, and it's easy, as I said before. And I know you're going to edit this, I hope, but it's easy because I'm going to repeat myself again. But the beautiful thing about the moon and the inspiration it has been for literature is you can see it.
Yeah. And
we were there. And it's bright. And, it's, as I've, said before, and I'll repeat in my blog post, it's got this absolutely gorgeous, luminous cratered face, which we've seen for centuries. Moonlight splashes across our buildings, it splashes across the sea in Greece. When you go back, and I think it's out of stock. Well, I know it's out of stock, but I'm going to try to get a copy. When you look at this Syrian satirist writer called Lucian,
yes,
he was considered to be the lunar literature pioneer. I've heard that mentioned before about him. When you read it, and there might be a way I can take it and make a PDF. I'll figure that out. There's a fascinating, and the reason it's a satire is these explorers have been blown off by this whirlwind, but they're happy because they have escaped, which was happening during their time period, these horrendous territorial conflicts. Mm-hmm. And they're happy to be on the moon. And the funny thing is that when they get on the moon, they find two other warring peoples called the Sunites and the Moonites. And, when you read it, you're like, okay, so this guy wrote this thing, what, in 2019? It's just amazing because he has, the humanoids are made out of glass, and the Moonites are their diet is frogs, which apparently are plentiful on the moon. It's amazing to see how or what inspired him. And when you read, and I got to get this one in because I'm Greek, Plutarch had written a book. The title is called Morale. It's not terribly important. And his is considered to be, while Lucian is considered to be the first true lunar literature, Plutarch was the first writer talking about lunar fiction who actually introduced what were then the current scientific ideas about astronomy.
Yeah.
And the fact that we on Earth are able to actually see the lunar surface, and that we're actually able to see that the moon has defined phases and orbits. And it was the first injection of science into lunar literature. And then, we're romping through the ages, to the Renaissance, and et cetera, and it just becomes more fascinating because you realize everybody's borrowing from the guy behind them. And, and I'll try to explain this in more detail, but as scientific discoveries are made, it's incorporated into the literature. And that, to me, as I mentioned earlier, also is fascinating because you've got, I don't remember the book, I have to find it, but basically the novelist at the time incorporated much of Galileo's research, much of Kepler's research. So you see this building, and you see this, you see the framing of the narrative both as a dream and fantastical with elements of science. And, to me, to watch that develop through the ages and to see, such diverse writers from Syria, from Greece, from Italy, from Spain, from England write about it, but also incorporating much of what they all knew, because that information began to be shared to a very high level, especially during the Renaissance, when, all of the science was, most of the science was available to almost anybody. So that's, that to me is, cool. And you see it, as I indicated in, Cyril de Bergerac's article, story, where they're harnessing solar power to project these devices, and then later on we get to something more sophisticated, and we actually have a rocket introduced, et cetera, et cetera. So did literature it went both ways. I'll answer my own question. Literature certainly influenced and inspired the science, and the science the literature. And again, you're more the authority than I am, but I'm sure there are other aspects, other types of science literature that it's happened the same way. Whereas I said before, we sit there and we go, these guys predicted it. Well, they had some help. Yeah. And, that to me makes, probably makes lunar literature more fun for me, because I actually can understand the science, and I understand what it is they're trying to convey, where I might not have that same ability with respect to other authors. I remember you and I had talked about, I can't remember his name now, the science, is it Ian Banks? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ian Banks I like, but he's talking about things that I guess he's talking more about society than anything else. But I like reading him, but I don't read him as much, because I get somewhat lost in what he's writing about. So and I need to have some basis. Before I pick up science fiction, I need to have some basis in fact, or at least some basis in science. So there are certain authors and certain people I'm going to read more. And, not that I'm stuck on lunar literature forever, but it's just a natural, it's a natural gravity point for me.
Yeah. Just picking up on some of these topics, and we were talking about conspiracy theories earlier. There was Robert Heinlein's novel for young adults, we'd call it now, Rocket Ship Galileo, which is in 1947, where three teenagers travel to the moon and discover a secret camp of Nazi fugitives. And of course, there is this conspiracy theory idea that the Nazis developed flying saucers and that they did move to the moon, and the Third Reich is up there, and there's been movies about the same thing. Iron Sky, I think, was the name of it. And again, it's an element of fiction being followed on by conspiracy and now believed as fact.
Well, that's a good one. You also have opened the lid on some other stuff, which is there are obviously many lunar literature books that mention something that we now consider to be true, and this goes back also to I don't want to disparage the younger generation, but it's like people who have seen the old Dick Tracy comics and believe that at the time those two-way wrist radios actually existed, because they read it there. Any young adult literature, and when I mean science fiction literature, is probably going to be totally inspired now by what exists. I mean, you're mentioning the Rocket Ship Galileo book, and that book came out in the 40s. I mean,
that came out in 1947, which of course
47.
is just starting to coincide with Roswell and the first flying saucer sightings.
But yeah, I mean, the book made sense in a way because, we've just dropped 2 atomic bombs. There's and what's interesting is his book talks about Nazi fugitives, and what's interesting is something that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about Werner von Braun. If you go to Berlin, and you are able to see, they have a museum there, which is obviously a brand new building, but it basically sits on the old Gestapo headquarters. And the name of the museum is called The Topography of Terror. And inside of it, there's some very, very, very good movies, but the most compelling, and I would say the most scary or disturbing elements are they have probably the most detailed exposition on what happened to all of the bad Nazis, so to speak, all the Gestapo guys, all the SS guys that are.
Yeah.
As you work your way, and you work your way through it by year, when you come toward the end, meaning when you come toward the end of the war, there is a section, and I'm sure they did it deliberately without saying it specifically or explicitly. You come across all of these Nazi scientists, none of whom were prosecuted. And when you start going through it and delving it, most of them were the rocket scientists.
Yes.
Which the U.S. scooped up, got out of there and brought them to the U.S.
Yeah.
And, we certainly have read enough about, once the war was over, you're no longer your enemy. You're no longer my enemy. You've done some atrocious things. The worst case being, as we know, the Klaus Barbie in France, who was protected by the United States for years before he was finally extradited because the U.S., who was eventually extradited and convicted back in France, because the U.S. found him to be helpful in fighting the communists.
Yeah.
Because, he had all of these contacts and he had all of these connections in this entire network. So all the atrocities he had done or participated in, were basically wiped from the books as far as the U.S. was concerned. And the same thing happened with many of these rocket scientists, because they weren't just rocket scientists, many of them were involved in the slave labor that was used to build the rockets, to develop the rockets. Many of them were, involved in atrocities themselves, and that was all erased. So, getting back to the Hyland's book, Rocket Ship Galileo, we're talking about the dark side, literally the dark side of this, and you cannot escape from it. I mean, it's it goes all the way back to I think the movie with Gregory Peck from the 70s, The Boys from Brazil, where all the key genetic scientists have been secured out and they're working on this next regime. And there's so many cases. I mean, I have read so many things about Werner von Braun and what he was involved in and what he was accused of and what he clearly was to be, should have been prosecuted for. But, he had all this rocket technology, and they wanted it.
It's like the joke that the reason the Americans got to the moon first was that they pinched the best German rocket scientists, and the ones the Russians scooped up weren't quite as good as them.
No, that's a good point. I mean, there's a whole history behind. When JFK first launched this idea, he had gone to he had a I think it was the one and only summit he ever had with Khrushchev in Vienna. He had proposed to him that, look, this is really something for mankind. Why don't you and I get together? But the Russians had not gone into the idea of space tech for greatness. They were looking at it as, a military advantage. Mm-hmm. And there's a book, obviously a lot of books, but one of the more recent books that came out a couple of months ago, which I read, I think, twice now, is a book by Oliver Morton called The Moon, and two other books which examined the politics that was behind it. And basically the United States, and again, they have to credit Lyndon Johnson, who was Kennedy's vice president, that Kennedy basically tasked with building this thing. And Johnson spared no expense at, pulling together not only rocket scientists, but he also had the CIA do everything they could to find out what the Russians are up to. And they realized in no short order, the Russians would love to get to the moon and would love to build rocket launchers on the moon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, Kennedy's speech is wonderful and inspiring, et cetera, but there was this political tension going on behind the scenes, and he had done, Johnson had done such a bang-up job that he was able to give tons and tons of contracts out to space engineering companies based in Texas. He made sure that the NASA, even though at the time, and there's a great article about the guys that actually built it. The Houston Space Center, the test facilities were basically in pastures. It's nothing like the complex it is today. But Johnson made sure that it was centered in Texas, and he picked Houston. So he brought thousands of jobs to the area, and people came in from all over the country to be focused in on Texas that normally would have never thought of going to Texas. He made sure also in Florida that, because that was the perfect place, Cape Canaveral, he made sure that those facilities were also fully supported and that the businesses were built there because, why? Florida was a big state politically. Mm-hmm. So as it is still today. So there's this other undercurrent going on. And, obviously outside the remit of this particular podcast, but in the books that I'm going to list in my bibliography, I've written summaries. And yes, audience, all 28 books, I've read all 28. So when I recommend something, I read it, and I'm going to give you a short summary of it. But when you read some of the background of what was going on, outside of what the media were talking about, I mean, one can only imagine if Twitter existed back then. Can you imagine? My God. That would have been phenomenal. But there's a tremendous undercurrent of what was going on that, really needs to be addressed and discussed. And I'm sure at some point in time, I mean, the only problem now is you just need to read a bunch of books.
Well, thank you, Greg, for your time on that.
Yeah. Okay, dude.
Take care.
Ciao, dude.
Earlier this year, we reported that the Creswell Crags in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, that's in England, the East Midlands in England, it had been discovered that there were hundreds of examples of apotropaic marks, sometimes known as witch marks, that had been scratched into the stonework at the mouth of the cave. These were little religious symbols that were meant to ward off evil. And they frequently be found on old timbers in old houses and in church porches. But this was a cave, and I say, full of them. Now, recently, the people who look after the cave arranged some evening visits, so you could go down into the cave at the beginning of September at just before 9 o'clock or at 10 o'clock and see the caves in the dark and shine your torch and be able to see the apotropaic marks in clear light. But the question I've always intrigued is, why were people scratching these things there in the first place? Now, yes, obviously it was to protect against evil, but did they go up there and think, this is a lucky place, there's a lot of harm and evil in the world, I'll scratch a mark here, scratch a witch mark for good luck, keep away evil on this cave? Or was it perhaps that they felt there was some evil lurking deep within the cave, and these marks were to not so much protect them from evil, but to trap evil deep within? I only mention this because not that far away in the Yorkshire Dales, there's a place called El Bolton Hill, and there's a cave at the top of that, various names for it, called including Navvy Noodle Hole and also the Gates of Hell. And some people say it's the Hill of the Fairies, others say it's a sacred hill of the dead. But here's the intriguing point. When the cave was first investigated in modern times, this was by a local vicar in 1888, he climbed down there and found the mummified bodies of three people sitting in, well, three people in a sitting position. The description is they were all in a sitting position with their knees drawn up under their chins, as if they'd been carefully placed around a long extinguished fire. And when he continued digging out the cave, and has to be admitted that back in those days, archaeological excavations by amateurs weren't that sophisticated in record keeping, but he also found the remains of at least 9 more human skeletons, as well as a lot of various animal bones. This does prompt the question of what were they doing down there at the bottom of this quite inaccessible little hole. It's about 20 feet deep and quite narrow, so it's not something you scramble down on a casual basis. So the bodies had either been put down there as a burial with their knees tucked under their chin, or perhaps they'd gone down voluntarily to pray, to meet their maker. Perhaps they were praying to some ancient god that lurked within. Well, we'll never know. But possibly the behaviour of the people at Creswell Crags, making all those witch marks at the mouth of that cave, had something similar in mind, that there was something evil in the bottom of the cave, and they wanted protecting from it. And that's it, almost out of time, but before I go, one final little story to tell you. And true story, last week I was on the phone to a business contact. It was tail end of the school holidays, and I could hear the sound of kids playing in the background in the room, and the person I was talking to kept repeatedly asking them to shut up. On I went, "Will you be quiet, you kids? I'm on the phone talking." "No, will you please shut up? Can you go out and play?" Finally, he snapped. "Don't make me ask Charles Christian to shout at you," he said. And they went quiet. So that's it. I'm officially a bogeyman who scares children. Though I'm available for bookings if you'd like me to come along and scare your children into behaving properly. You know where to contact me. And if you need any help, here's a little message for you.
Naughty children, behave, for I am the bogeyman, and I have the power to make you sit on the naughty step until the end of time.
And that's it. I'm Charles Christian. Thank you very much for listening to the show. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you'll join us again next week. But until then, stay well, stay weird. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.